The clock on the wall showed 11 at night when Raymond pushed his mop across the marble floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel. The ballroom was empty now. Just an hour ago, this same room had been full of people in expensive suits and beautiful dresses. Now it was just him, the silence, and the smell of floor cleaner. Raymond had been working at this hotel for 11 years. 11 years of mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and emptying trash cans. 11 years of watching rich people walk past him like he was part of the furniture. They never looked at him. They never said hello. To them, he was just the man in the blue uniform who made sure the floors were shiny. He was 53 years old now. His hair had turned gray at the sides, and his hands were rough from years of hard work. But his eyes still held something deep inside them, something that most people never noticed because they never bothered to look. Every night, Raymond followed the same routine. He started with the lobby, then moved to the conference rooms, and finally ended with the grand ballroom. The ballroom was his favorite place to clean, not because it was easy, but because of what sat in the corner of that room: a piano. A beautiful grand piano that cost more than he would earn in 10 years. Tonight, like every other night, Raymond finished his mopping and stood still for a moment. He looked around to make sure no one was watching. The security cameras were there, but he knew the night guard usually fell asleep around this time. He had learned the patterns of this place. He knew when he could steal a few moments for himself. Raymond walked slowly toward the piano. He pulled out the bench and sat down. The leather was cold against his worn work pants. He placed his fingers on the keys, but did not press them yet. He just sat there, feeling the smooth ivory under his fingertips. This was his secret. The one thing nobody knew about him. 30 years ago, Raymond had been a different man. He had been a pianist. Not just someone who played for fun, but a real musician who had trained at one of the best music schools in the country. His teachers had said he had a gift. They said his fingers could make the piano sing in ways that touched people's hearts. He had dreams back then. Big dreams. He was going to perform in concert halls. He was going to travel the world and share his music with thousands of people. He was going to make his parents proud. He was going to make her proud. Her name was Catherine. She had brown hair that fell past her shoulders and a smile that could light up any room. They met when Raymond was 24 years old. She had come to one of his small performances at a local theater. After the show, she waited for him outside and told him that his music had made her cry. They fell in love quickly. Within 2 years, they were married. Catherine believed in him more than anyone else ever had. When he doubted himself, she would hold his hand and tell him that the world needed to hear his music. She was his biggest supporter, his best friend, and the love of his life. For 5 beautiful years, they built a life together. Raymond's career was growing. He had started getting invitations to perform at bigger events. Music critics were beginning to notice him. Everything was falling into place. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a rainy evening in November. Raymond had just finished a performance in another city and was driving home to surprise Catherine. She did not know he was coming back early. He wanted to see the look on her face when he walked through the door. He never made it home. A drunk driver ran a red light and crashed into his car. Raymond woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. The first thing he asked about was Catherine. The doctors looked at each other with heavy eyes. That was when he knew. Catherine had been driving to pick him up from the airport. She did not know he had decided to drive instead. She was on the road because of him, and now she was gone. Raymond survived. But something inside him died that night. He could not look at a piano without seeing her face. He could not hear music without remembering her voice. The gift that everyone said he had became a curse. Every note reminded him of what he had lost. He stopped playing. He stopped performing. He stopped dreaming. The years passed slowly after that. Raymond could not hold down any job that involved music. The pain was too much. So he took whatever work he could find. He worked at factories. He worked at warehouses. And eventually, he ended up here, at the Grand Meridian Hotel, pushing a mop across marble floors. His family tried to help him at first. His mother begged him to play again. His sister sent him letters, asking him to come visit. But Raymond had built walls around his heart. He did not want help. He did not want to feel anything. He just wanted to exist quietly until his time on this earth was done. 11 years at this hotel had taught him how to be invisible. He learned to keep his head down. He learned to speak only when spoken to. He learned to move through rooms without being noticed. It was easier that way. No questions. No conversations. No connections. But late at night, when the hotel was empty and the world was asleep, Raymond allowed himself one small thing. He would sit at this piano and let his fingers remember what his heart tried to forget. He never played loudly, just soft melodies that floated through the empty ballroom like whispers. Sometimes he played songs that Catherine had loved. Sometimes he played pieces from his old performances. And sometimes he just let his fingers move without thinking, creating music that came from somewhere deep inside his soul. Tonight, he played a simple melody. Something slow and sad. The notes hung in the air like ghosts. Raymond closed his eyes and let himself drift back to better times. He could almost see Catherine sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. A tear rolled down his cheek. After all these years, the pain was still there. It had become quieter, but it never went away. He had learned to live with it, like a wound that never fully healed. The song ended, and Raymond sat in silence for a long moment. Then he carefully closed the piano lid and stood up. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and picked up his mop. Tomorrow night, he would be back. As he walked toward the supply closet to put away his equipment, Raymond had no idea that his life was about to change. He did not know that fate had something planned for him, something that would pull him out of the shadows and force him to face everything he had been running from. But that is how life works sometimes. The biggest moments come when we least expect them. And for Raymond, that moment was only 1 week away. The hotel was preparing for its biggest event of the year. The annual Wellington Foundation Gala was coming. Billionaires, celebrities, and important people from all over would fill this very ballroom. A famous pianist had been hired to perform. Raymond had heard the staff talking about it. He had seen the decorations being planned, but he paid no attention. Events like that were not for people like him. He would do his job, stay invisible, and clean up after everyone left. He had no idea that this gala would become the night that changed everything. The night that would force him to choose between staying hidden and stepping into the light. The night that a room full of wealthy strangers would witness something they would never forget. But for now, Raymond was just a janitor finishing his shift. He clocked out at 2 in the morning, walked to his small apartment 3 blocks away, and fell asleep in his empty bed. The piano in his living room sat untouched, covered in dust, just like his dreams. 5 days passed quickly at the Grand Windsor Hotel. Thomas watched the preparations for the Wellington Foundation Gala from a distance. Workers came in every day to set up decorations. Flowers arrived by the truckload. The kitchen staff worked overtime preparing food that Thomas could not even pronounce. This was the biggest event the hotel hosted each year. Billionaires, politicians, famous actors, and business leaders from around the world would be attending. The tickets alone cost more than what Thomas earned in an entire year. It was the kind of night where deals worth millions were made over glasses of champagne. Thomas did not care about any of it. His job was simple: stay out of the way during the event, then clean up after everyone left. He had done this for 12 years. Nothing ever changed. On the night of the gala, Thomas arrived at work early. The hotel was buzzing with energy. Staff members rushed around in every direction. Everyone looked nervous and excited at the same time. Thomas walked through the back hallways to the employee locker room, changed into his uniform, and found a quiet corner to wait. He could hear the guests arriving through the walls, expensive cars pulling up to the entrance, people laughing and greeting each other. The sound of an orchestra warming up in the ballroom. It was a different world out there. A world that had nothing to do with him. Around 8 in the evening, the main event began. Thomas knew the schedule because he had seen it posted in the staff room. Dinner would be served first. Then, there would be speeches from important people. And finally, the highlight of the night, a piano performance by a famous musician who had been flown in from Vienna. The pianist's name was Heinrich Müller. Thomas had heard the other staff members talking about him all week. Apparently, he was one of the best in the world. He had performed for kings and presidents. His concerts sold out in minutes. The Wellington Foundation had paid a fortune to bring him here. Thomas felt a strange twisting in his stomach when he heard about the pianist. It reminded him of the life he had left behind. The life where he was the one people talked about. The life where he was the one on stage. He pushed those thoughts away and focused on his work. There were hallways to mop and bathrooms to check. The gala was not his concern, but fate had other plans. Around 9:30, Thomas was cleaning near the backstage area when he heard shouting. He looked up and saw people running. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He moved closer, staying in the shadows like he always did. That was when he saw it. Heinrich Müller, the famous pianist, was lying on the ground. His face was pale and covered in sweat. He was clutching his chest and gasping for air. Someone yelled for a doctor. Someone else called for an ambulance. The backstage area turned into chaos. Staff members were panicking. Security guards were trying to keep people back. And in the middle of it all, the great Heinrich Müller was being carried away on a stretcher. Thomas watched as the ambulance lights flashed through the back windows. The pianist was gone. Rushed to the hospital with what looked like a heart problem. And just like that, the highlight of the Wellington Foundation Gala had disappeared. The event coordinator, a tall woman named Mrs. Patterson, stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth. Thomas had seen her around the hotel many times. She was always calm and in control. But tonight, she looked like she was about to fall apart. Other staff members gathered around her. Thomas could hear pieces of their conversation from where he stood. There was no backup plan. No other pianist. The performance was supposed to start in 30 minutes. 300 of the most important people in the city were sitting in that ballroom, waiting for a show that could not happen. Mrs. Patterson was making phone calls, but Thomas could tell from her face that nothing was working. Every pianist she called was either unavailable or too far away. The situation was impossible. Thomas felt his heart beating faster. A voice in his head was saying something. A voice he had not heard in a very long time. It was telling him to step forward, to say something, to offer what he had kept hidden for so many years. He tried to ignore it. This was not his problem. He was just a janitor. Nobody knew he could play. Nobody would believe him even if he told them. And more importantly, he had not performed in front of an audience in over 20 years. The idea terrified him, but the voice would not stop. It sounded like Eleanor. It sounded like her, telling him to be brave, telling him that his music was meant to be shared, telling him that hiding was not the same as living. Thomas closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. Everything inside him was screaming to walk away, to go back to his mop and his quiet corner, and pretend he had not seen anything, but his feet had other ideas. Before he knew what was happening, he was walking toward Mrs. Patterson. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. His mouth opened, and words came out that he did not plan to say. "I can play." Mrs. Patterson turned and looked at him. Her eyes moved from his face down to his uniform. The confusion on her face was clear. She did not understand what she was hearing. "Excuse me," she said. Thomas swallowed hard. His throat was dry. "I can play the piano," he said again. "I know it sounds crazy, but I can do it." For a moment, nobody moved. The other staff members stared at him like he had lost his mind. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like anger. "This is not a joke," she said. "Do you have any idea what is at stake tonight? These are some of the most powerful people in the country. I cannot put a janitor on that stage." Thomas nodded. He understood how it looked. He understood that he was nobody in this place. Just the man who cleaned up after everyone else. Why would anyone believe he could do something like this? But something inside him had woken up. Something that had been sleeping for 20 years. He looked Mrs. Patterson directly in the eyes and spoke with a voice that surprised even himself. "I trained at the Royal Conservatory. I used to perform professionally before I came here. I know I do not look like much right now, but I promise you, I can play." Mrs. Patterson studied his face. The seconds felt like hours. Behind her, a staff member whispered something about how they had no other choice. The clock on the wall kept ticking. The guests in the ballroom were waiting. Finally, Mrs. Patterson let out a long breath. She looked exhausted and desperate and out of options. "If you embarrass this hotel," she said slowly, "you will be fired before you leave that stage. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded. He understood perfectly. His entire life at this hotel, the only stability he had known for 12 years, was now on the line. One mistake, and it would all be gone. But for the first time in 2 decades, Thomas did not feel afraid of losing something. He felt afraid of never trying. He felt afraid of spending the rest of his life wondering what could have been. Mrs. Patterson pointed toward the ballroom. "Then go," she said. "You have 15 minutes. Thomas turned and started walking. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The hallway seemed to stretch forever. Each step brought him closer to a moment he never thought he would face again. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about all the nights she sat in the audience, believing in him. He thought about the promise he had made to himself after she died. The promise to never play again. Tonight, he was about to break that promise. And he had no idea if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or finally waking up from a nightmare that had lasted far too long. The walk from the backstage area to the ballroom was the longest walk of Thomas's life. His legs felt heavy, like he was moving through water. Every step echoed in the hallway, and every echo reminded him that he was about to do something he had promised himself he would never do again. He looked down at his clothes. He was still wearing his janitor uniform, the same faded blue shirt he wore every night to mop floors, the same worn-out pants with a small tear near the knee. His shoes were old and scuffed from years of hard work. He did not look like a performer. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who cleaned up after rich people. But it was too late to change, too late to turn back. Mrs. Patterson had given him 15 minutes, and half of that time was already gone. As he got closer to the ballroom, Thomas could hear the noise from inside. Hundreds of voices talking at once. The clinking of glasses. Laughter from people who had no idea that anything was wrong. They were all waiting for a world-famous pianist to walk onto that stage. Instead, they were going to get him. Thomas stopped just outside the entrance. His hands were trembling. He pressed them against his legs to make them stop, but it did not work. His whole body was shaking now. Fear had wrapped itself around him like a cold blanket. What was he doing? Who did he think he was? He had not touched a piano in front of an audience for over 20 years. The last time he performed publicly, he was a different man. Younger, confident, full of hope. That man was gone now. He died in that car crash along with Eleanor. For a moment, Thomas seriously thought about turning around. He could go back to Mrs. Patterson and tell her he made a mistake. He could apologize and return to his mop and his quiet corner. Nobody would ever know. Nobody would ever talk about it. Life would go on exactly as it had before. But then he heard Eleanor's voice in his head. It was so clear, so real, that he almost looked around to see if she was standing next to him. "You are braver than you think," she used to tell him before every performance. The world needs to hear what is inside you. Thomas took a deep breath. His eyes were wet, but he blinked the tears away. He could not fall apart now. Not here. Not tonight. A staff member appeared beside him. She was young, maybe 25, with a worried look on her face. "Mrs. Patterson sent me," she said. "I am supposed to introduce you, but she did not tell me your name or what to say." Thomas looked at her. For a second, he did not know what to answer. He had been invisible for so long that he had almost forgotten who he used to be. "Just say that there has been a change in the program," he said quietly. "Do not say my name. Do not explain anything. Just let me walk out there and sit down." The young woman nodded, though she still looked confused. She pushed open the door to the ballroom, and suddenly Thomas was hit with bright lights and the smell of expensive perfume. The room was massive. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Round tables covered in white cloth filled the space, and at each table sat people who probably had more money than Thomas would ever see in his lifetime. He stayed near the wall as the young woman walked toward the stage. She climbed the few steps and approached the microphone. The room slowly grew quiet as people noticed her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice a little shaky, "there has been a small change in tonight's program. Please welcome our pianist for the evening." That was it. No name. No introduction. Just those simple words hanging in the air. Thomas forced his legs to move. He stepped out from the shadows and started walking toward the stage. The distance was maybe 50 feet, but it felt like a mile. He could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him. He could hear the whispers starting. "Who is that?" someone asked from a nearby table. "Is that a member of the staff?" another voice said. Thomas kept his head down and kept walking. He did not want to see their faces. He did not want to see the confusion and judgment in their eyes. He just focused on putting one foot in front of the other until he reached the stage. The stairs creaked slightly under his weight as he climbed them. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, shining under the spotlights. It was even more beautiful than the one he played late at night when the hotel was empty. This was a concert piano, the kind made for performances like this. Thomas walked toward it slowly. Behind him, the whispers had grown louder. He heard someone laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh that said this was a joke, that something had gone wrong, that this man in a janitor uniform had no business being on this stage. He sat down on the bench. The leather was warm from the stage lights. He placed his hands on his knees and looked at the piano keys in front of him. They were perfect, white and black, stretching out in a pattern he knew better than his own face. The room had not gone completely quiet. People were still talking, still whispering, still trying to figure out what was happening. Thomas could feel their doubt pressing against him from all sides. These were people who had paid thousands of dollars to be here tonight. They expected perfection. They expected someone famous. They did not expect a 54-year-old janitor with gray hair and worn-out shoes. Thomas closed his eyes. The noise of the room faded away. He was not in the ballroom anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere deep inside his own memories. He saw Eleanor sitting in the front row of a small theater, her eyes shining with pride. He saw his younger self, full of dreams, sitting at a piano just like this one. He saw all the years that had passed, all the pain he had carried, all the music he had kept locked inside, and he realized something in that moment. He was not doing this for the wealthy people in this room. He was not doing this for Mrs. Patterson, or for his job. He was not even doing this to prove that he still could. He was doing this for Eleanor. For the woman who had always believed in him, even when he did not believe in himself. For the love that had never faded, even after all these years. For the promise he had broken and the guilt he had carried every single day since she died. Tonight, he would play for her one more time. Thomas opened his eyes. His hands moved to the keys. The room was still noisy, but he did not hear it anymore. There was only the piano, only the music, waiting to come out. He took one last breath And then he began to play. The first note rang out across the ballroom, clear and pure. It cut through the whispers like a knife through silk. By the second note, a few people had stopped talking. By the third, the entire room had fallen silent. Thomas played the opening of a piece he had not performed in over 20 years. It was Chopin, one of the most difficult compositions ever written for piano. His fingers moved across the keys like they had never stopped. The music poured out of him, filling every corner of the massive room. He did not think about the audience. He did not think about his uniform, or his old shoes, or the whispers from before. He thought only about Eleanor, about her smile, about her voice, about the way she used to hold his hand and tell him everything would be okay. And somewhere in that room, 300 wealthy strangers sat frozen in their seats, watching something they would never forget. The music filled the ballroom like nothing anyone had ever heard before. It started soft and gentle, like a whisper in the dark. Then it grew, building layer upon layer, until it seemed to wrap around every person in the room. Thomas played with his eyes closed, his fingers dancing across the keys as if they had a mind of their own. The wealthy guests sat completely still. Champagne glasses remained untouched. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the waiters stopped moving, frozen in place, with trays in their hands. Nobody had expected this. Nobody had been prepared for what was happening on that stage. A woman in the front row was the first to cry. She was older, maybe 70, wearing diamonds around her neck that probably cost more than most houses. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the music reached inside her and touched something she had forgotten was there. She was not alone. Throughout the room, people began to feel things they had not felt in years. A businessman, who had not cried since his father died 20 years ago, found himself wiping his eyes. A young socialite who spent her days worrying about appearances felt her heart break open in the most beautiful way. An elderly man reached for his wife's hand and held it tight. Remembering the day they first met, Thomas knew none of this. He was lost in the music, swimming in memories that he had kept locked away for so long. Each note was a piece of his story. The joy of meeting Eleanor, the happiness of their wedding day, the dreams they had built together, and then the pain, the terrible, crushing pain of losing her. His fingers moved from the Chopin piece into something else, something he had written himself, many years ago, for Eleanor, on their 5th anniversary. He had never played it for anyone else. It was too personal, too raw. But tonight, it poured out of him like it had been waiting all these years to be heard. The melody was simple but heartbreaking. It spoke of love that never dies, of loss that never heals, of a heart that keeps beating even when it feels like it should stop. The notes hung in the air, each one carrying the weight of everything Thomas had been through. In the back of the room, Mrs. Patterson stood with her hand over her mouth. She had been ready to fire this man if he embarrassed the hotel. She had been prepared for disaster. Instead, she was witnessing something she would remember for the rest of her life. The young staff member who had introduced Thomas stood beside her, tears streaming down her face. "Who is he?" she whispered. "How did we not know?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head slowly. She had no answer. For 12 years, this man had walked the halls of her hotel, invisible to everyone. For 12 years, he had carried this gift inside him, hidden from the world. She felt ashamed that she had never bothered to learn his name. On stage, Thomas transitioned into another piece. This one was lighter, more hopeful. It was the song that had been playing when he first saw Eleanor at that coffee shop. He remembered every detail of that day. The way the sunlight came through the window. The way she laughed when he spilled her drink. The way his heart knew, even then, that she was the one. The music lifted the room. People who had been crying found themselves smiling through their tears. The heaviness in the air transformed into something beautiful. It was like watching the sun rise after the longest night. A man near the middle of the room leaned over to his wife. He was a film producer, someone who had seen thousands of performances in his career. "This is the most incredible thing I have ever witnessed," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. At another table, a tech billionaire had taken out his phone. Not to check messages, but to record. He wanted to capture this moment, to prove to himself later that it had really happened. His phone was not the only one. Throughout the room, screens glowed as people tried to hold on to something that felt impossible. Thomas played for nearly 40 minutes. He moved through pieces he had not touched in decades. Songs he had performed in concert halls when he was young. Songs he had written for Eleanor during quiet evenings at home. Songs that had lived only in his memory for over 20 years. With each piece, he felt something changing inside him. The walls he had built around his heart were crumbling. The pain was still there, but it was different now. It was not a prison anymore. It was a door. And on the other side of that door was something he had not felt in a very long time. Hope. When he finally played the last note, the sound faded slowly into silence. Thomas sat motionless at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys. He was breathing hard, like he had just run a marathon. His cheeks were wet with tears he did not remember crying. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was completely silent. 300 people sat, without making a sound. It was as if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person stood up. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. The applause started like thunder. It filled the room, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling, surrounding Thomas from every direction. People were not just clapping, they were shouting, cheering, calling out words that Thomas could not quite hear over the noise. He opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd for the first time since he had started playing. What he saw took his breath away. Every single person in that room was standing. Many were still crying. All of them were looking at him like he was something precious, something rare, something they had never expected to find in a place like this. Thomas did not know what to do. He had not planned for this. He had not planned for any of this. Slowly, he rose from the piano bench. His legs were shaky, and he had to hold onto the piano for support. The applause continued. It showed no sign of stopping. People began moving toward the stage, wanting to get closer, wanting to be near the man who had just changed something inside them. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd. When she reached the edge of the stage, she looked up at Thomas with tears in her eyes. She did not say anything at first. She just stared at him like she was seeing him for the very first time. "I am so sorry," she finally said. Her voice cracked on the words. "I had no idea. None of us had any idea." Thomas looked down at her. He wanted to say something, but his throat was too tight. Instead, he just nodded. It was enough. The applause went on for nearly 10 minutes. People did not want to stop. They did not want to let go of what they had just experienced. Some guests came up to the stage to shake his hand. Others simply stood at their tables, clapping until their palms were red and sore. When the room finally began to quiet down, Thomas realized something had shifted. Not just in the audience, but in himself. For the first time in 20 years, he did not feel invisible. He felt alive. And somewhere, in a place beyond this world, he knew Eleanor was smiling. The night of the gala ended, but Thomas's story was only beginning. He went home that evening in a daze, still wearing his janitor uniform, still trying to understand what had happened. His small apartment felt different somehow. The silence that had always felt heavy now felt peaceful. Something had changed inside him, and he could not quite name it yet. He slept better that night than he had in 20 years. No nightmares. No waking up in the middle of the night reaching for Eleanor. Just deep, quiet rest. The next morning, His phone started ringing. It was an old phone, the kind that could barely connect to the internet. He almost never got calls. But that day, it did not stop. First it was Mrs. Patterson, asking him to come to the hotel. Then it was numbers he did not recognize. Then more numbers. And more. Thomas ignored most of them. He got dressed and walked to the hotel like he did every day. But when he arrived, everything was different. Staff members who had never spoken to him before stopped to shake his hand. The security guard, who usually just nodded at him, stood up and saluted. The front desk manager came out from behind her counter just to say good morning. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for him in her office. She looked like she had not slept at all. There were papers spread across her desk, and her computer screen was filled with emails. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. Thomas sat in the chair across from her. He felt like a student called to the principal's office, even though he had done nothing wrong. Mrs. Patterson turned her computer screen toward him. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Thomas looked at the screen. It was a video. The thumbnail showed him sitting at the piano in his blue uniform. The view count underneath made his eyes go wide. 4 million views. And it had only been posted 12 hours ago. "Someone recorded your performance last night," Mrs. Patterson explained. "They put it online, and it has spread everywhere. News stations are calling. Newspapers want interviews. I have had music producers calling since 6 in the morning." Thomas stared at the screen. He did not know what to say. He had not thought about any of this. He had not considered that the world beyond that ballroom would ever know what happened. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. "I need to apologize to you properly," she said. "For 12 years, you worked in this hotel. For 12 years, I walked past you without ever asking your name. I treated you like you were invisible. And I am ashamed of that." Thomas shook his head slowly. "You did not know," he said quietly. "I did not want anyone to know." "That does not make it right," she replied. "You are an extraordinary person, Thomas. And you deserve to be treated like one." Over the next few days, Thomas's life turned upside down. The janitor who stunned a room full of billionaires. The hidden pianist who played his way out of the shadows. Interview requests poured in. Talk shows wanted him to appear. Record labels wanted to sign him. Concert halls offered him spots to perform. A famous director even called about making a movie based on his life. Thomas said no to almost everything. He did not want fame. He did not want to be on television or have his face on magazines. That was never what the music was about for him. The music was about Eleanor. It was about love. It was about healing. But he did say yes to one thing. A small music school on the other side of the city reached out to him. They taught piano to children from poor families, kids who could never afford lessons otherwise. The school was struggling. They barely had enough money to keep the lights on. They asked Thomas if he would consider teaching there, even just once a week. Thomas visited the school on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a small building with peeling paint and old furniture. The pianos were out of tune and missing keys. But the children were something else entirely. They looked at him with wide eyes full of curiosity. Most of them had never met a real pianist before. They did not care about the viral video or the news stories. They just wanted to learn. Thomas sat down at one of the broken pianos and played a simple melody. The children gathered around him, watching his fingers move across the keys. When he finished, a little girl in the front row tugged on his sleeve. "Can you teach me to do that?" she asked. Thomas looked into her eyes and saw something he recognized. Hope. The same hope he had felt when he was young, before life had knocked him down. The same hope that Eleanor had always believed in. "Yes," he said, "I can teach you." He started working at the school 3 days a week. He did not take any payment. The joy on the children's faces was worth more than any salary. He taught them scales and chords and simple songs. He told them stories about the great composers. He showed them that music was not just notes on a page, but a way to express everything inside their hearts. On weekends, Thomas began performing again. Not at big concert halls or fancy galas, but at small community centers and charity events. He played for free, donating whatever money was raised to causes that mattered. Families affected by drunk driving, music programs for underprivileged youth, shelters for people who had lost everything. Some of the wealthy guests from that night at the Wellington Foundation Gala became regular donors to these causes. They had been changed by what they witnessed, and they wanted to be part of something meaningful. A billionaire who had cried during the performance funded the renovation of the music school. A famous actress started a scholarship in Eleanor's name. Thomas never went back to mopping floors. Mrs. Patterson offered him a permanent position as the hotel's official pianist, and he accepted. Every evening, he played in the lobby for guests passing through. Some recognized him from the video. Others had no idea who he was. It did not matter to Thomas either way. He was not playing for recognition. He was playing because his heart was finally open again. 1 year after that unforgettable night, Thomas sat alone in the ballroom where everything had changed. It was late, and the hotel was quiet. The same grand piano stood in the same spot, waiting for him like an old friend. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The melody drifted through the empty room, soft and full of feeling. It was the song he had written for Eleanor all those years ago. As he played, he did not feel sad anymore. He felt grateful. Grateful for the love they had shared. Grateful for the music that had brought him back to life. Grateful for the second chance he never expected to receive. He finished the song and sat in silence for a moment. Then, he whispered 2 words into the empty room. "Thank you." He was not sure if he was talking to Eleanor, or to fate, or to something bigger than both. But he knew, deep in his heart, that she had heard him. Thomas stood up from the piano and walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed in the ballroom, just like they had 1,000 nights before. But everything was different now. He was no longer the invisible man. He was Thomas, a pianist, a teacher, a man who had learned that it is never too late to start again. And somewhere out there, in a place beyond the stars, Eleanor was still smiling.